The aircraft we will talk about had quite an unusual name, 112 Strutter, which can be translated as 1.5 Strutter. Although such machines once flew millions of kilometers in the skies over Russia, this name never took root there. Unlike other Sopwith aviation aircraft, for example, the Camels or Snipes, which retained their English names, the 1.5 Strutter remained in the memory of aviation veterans simply as the Sopwith. The first aircraft of the famous British aircraft designer Thomas Sopwith to gain worldwide fame was the small sports biplane Tabloid of 1913. This elegant two-seater machine demonstrated excellent flight characteristics and in the same year won the prestigious Schneider Trophy air race. With the outbreak of the First World War, the Tabloid, like most aircraft of that time, was tried in military use. Several machines were sent to the front, but it soon became clear that the qualities required of an Army reconnaissance aircraft were very different from those for which the Tabloid had been designed. To reduce air resistance and improve speed characteristics, Sopwith minimized the aircraft's dimensions, reducing the wingspan and wing area, which made control more difficult and increased landing speed. In addition, the pilots and passenger seats in the Tabloid cockpit were positioned side by side. This layout was suitable for a training aircraft. But when an observer pilot occupied the passenger seat, it immediately became clear that his field of view was insufficient. Simply put, he could only look in one direction. The first experience of combat use of aircraft allowed a rough outline of a universal frontline aircraft, a reconnaissance machine, an artillery fire spotter, and a light bomber. It was a two-seat biplane with a tractor propeller, a crew seated one behind the other, and a movable machine gun for self-defense in the rear observer's cockpit. By the way, initially British and German reconnaissance aircraft were created with reversed crew placement. The observer pilot sat in the front and the pilot behind. It was believed that this way the observer had better visibility. But the appearance of fighter aircraft in the summer of 1915 immediately revealed the flaw in this layout. The machine gun turret in the front cockpit had very limited firing angles, and the pilot, seated behind and occupied with flying, could not be distracted by shooting. Therefore, for effective self-defense, it was necessary to sacrifice observer visibility and swap the pilot and observer. From then on, this scheme became classic and was applied for the next 2 decades. But the first aircraft with the correct crew arrangement in the countries of the anti-German coalition was the machine designed in the autumn of 1915 under the direction of Thomas Sopwith. The new Sopwith was typical of its time, an all-wooden biplane with fabric covering. Only the front part of the fuselage behind the engine cowling was covered with aluminum sheets. The detachable rotary engine cowling was also made of aluminum. The frames of the rudders, ailerons, and tail unit were welded from thin-walled steel tubes, and the bracing was made of profiled steel strips. The pilots' and observers' cockpits were spaced 5 feet apart along the fuselage, with a fuel tank between them. Obviously, this was done to place the tank closer to the center of gravity, thereby reducing the effect of fuel consumption on balance. However, this arrangement sometimes drew complaints from aviators who could not maintain communication during flight. Of course, no onboard intercom devices existed yet. To solve the problem, a special signaling system was developed using a rope. One end was tied to the pilot's left hand, and the other ran into the observer's cockpit. By pulling the rope a certain number of times, the observer transmitted commands to the pilot, for example, 1 tug, descend, 2, climb, and so on. The first prototype of the machine was fitted with a 9-cylinder rotary Clerget engine producing 110 horsepower, but later serial Sopwiths were equipped with various modifications of rotary engines Clerget, Gnome, or Ron, ranging from 100 to 135 horsepower. Such variation in power naturally had a strong effect on flight performance. The main external feature of the aircraft, which gave it its nickname, was the peculiar design of the biplane box. The upper wing, without a central section, was attached to the fuselage using a central cabane and 4 additional diagonal struts that connected the upper fuselage spars with the wing spars. As a result, a fairly strong and rigid structure was obtained, which from the front resembled the Latin letter W. But the innovations of the aircraft were not limited to this. In its description, one often has to repeat the word "for the first time." Thus, for the first time in British aviation, the 1.5 Strutter was equipped with a stabilizer with an in-flight adjustable angle of incidence. For the first time, aerodynamic brakes were installed, rectangular flaps on the trailing edge of the wing that deflected 90 degrees, significantly reducing landing roll distance. The landing gear was for the first time fitted with independent wheel suspension with swinging half axles. This improved shock absorption and increased the aircraft's stability during taxiing, especially on uneven field airstrips. And finally, Sopwith's biplane was the first among Allied aircraft and the second in the world, after the famous Fokker fighter, to receive a synchronized machine gun. Interestingly, the synchronized armament was tested not on a single-seat fighter, but on a relatively large two-seater machine. The first prototype of the 1.5 Strutter went for trials on December 16, 1915. Despite the bad weather of the rainy British winter, the tests were successfully completed on January 24, 1916. As a result, no changes had to be made to the aircraft's design. The first buyer of the new aeroplanes was the British Admiralty, with which Sopwith had long maintained strong ties. From the very beginning of the war, the company had been building float seaplanes for the Navy under contract. The land-based 1.5 Strutter also appealed to the Naval Command, and a contract was signed with the firm for the construction of 150 aircraft. By March, serial production planes were already coming off the Sopwith factory lines in Eastchurch. On April 14th, the first 2 aircraft were delivered to the 5th Wing of the Royal Naval Air Service, which was fighting on the Western Front. In early May, another 6 arrived. Further deliveries increased steadily. The first production machines carried in the rear cockpit a rather bulky and inconvenient ETV French-type rotating machine gun mount. Nevertheless, the aircraft's armament was considered sufficient for its use as an escort fighter. In May-June 1916, Sopwiths escorted Breguet and Caudron bombers in their raids on German targets in Flanders. In the summer, improved scarf ring mounts with rubber counterbalances for the weapon's weight began to be installed on the 1.5 Strutters. Soon, bomber modifications of the aircraft appeared as well. From the summer of 1916, 3 versions of the 1.5 Strutter were produced in parallel: a long-range 2-seat fighter, a 2-seat short-range fighter bomber with a reduced fuel tank, beneath which a small bay for 110 pounds of light bombs was arranged, and also a single-seat bomber. In the latter, instead of the rear cockpit, a fairly capacious bomb compartment for 4 65-pound bombs was installed. Interestingly, the single-seat version, both in appearance and equipment, a synchronized machine gun, resembled a fighter more than a bomber. Since this aircraft carried no defensive armament, it was intended to be used only together with the 2-seat modifications. The main drawback of the machine was its low power, caused by the relatively weak rotary engines even by the standards of that time. Because of this, the 2-seat Sopwith carried only a limited combat load, and the single-seat version could not escape from enemy fighters and itself required protection. However, more powerful, faster, and higher capacity bombers only appeared in Britain at the end of 1916. Until then, the 1.5 Strutters were actively used on the Western Front, in Macedonia, and in the Middle East. Moreover, the French, who often lacked escort fighters, frequently appealed to the British command with requests to allocate Sopwiths to cover their bombers. As an example, one may recall the large daytime bombing raid by French Farman and Breguet Michelin bombers on the Mauser Armament Works in Oberndorf on October 12, 1916. The French were escorted by 20 Sopwiths from the 3rd Wing of the Naval Air Service. The combined squadron had to fly more than 143 miles over enemy territory. Near the target, the Allies encountered heavy anti-aircraft fire and fierce attacks from interceptors. The Germans threw everything that could fly into the air, including even Gotha twin-engine bombers. 6 French planes and 3 British machines were shot down, but the rest carried out their mission. In addition to the Royal Navy, the 1.5 Strutters were also in service with the Royal Flying Corps and the Air Defense Forces. The Flying Corps first used these aircraft in July 1916 during the intense battles on the Somme. If the Sopwiths of the Flying Corps differed from their naval counterparts in nothing but the pilots' uniforms, the air defense machines usually had significant differences in equipment and armament. Night fighters were fitted with a powerful searchlight mounted above the upper wing. Aircraft intended for hunting zeppelins underwent more substantial modifications. The front cockpit was faired over, and in its place an additional fuel tank was installed. Since German airships often flew at altitudes unreachable for interceptors, it was necessary to provide the ability to fire upward. To this end, 2 Lewis machine guns with ammunition composed of incendiary and tracer rounds were mounted at an angle of 80 degrees to the fuselage in front of the rear cockpit, where the pilot now sat. About 70 such aircraft were built. They served for quite a long time in the London air defense system, but not a single Zeppelin was ever brought down by them. In 1918, experiments were conducted with the use of Sopwiths as carrier-based reconnaissance aircraft and naval artillery spotters. Several methods of basing the aircraft on warships were developed. In one case, the undercarriage trolley was equipped with special brakes and anti-nose-over skids for landing on the deck. Such an aircraft was tested on one of Britain's first aircraft carriers, HMS Argus. In another case, the aircraft was fitted with skid landing gear. Braking was carried out simply by friction against the deck planking, and at the end of the run, the machine was caught by hand. Furthermore, in the summer of 1918, during trials, the 1.5 Strutter took off, without a catapult, from a short platform laid across the turret and gun barrels of the main batteries of the battleships Repulse and Inflexible. In this case, the landing was to be made at the nearest land airfield, or if too far from the coast, simply on the water. Thanks to airbags built into the fuselage, the aircraft could remain afloat for a long time while the crew awaited a rescue boat. The experiments with using these aircraft on carriers were deemed successful, and by the end of the war, Sopwiths were permanently based on the carriers Furious, Argus, and New Zealand. However, the use of disposable spotting planes on battleships proved economically unfeasible. Later, float seaplanes began to be used for this purpose instead. Sopwiths fought in the frontline units of the British Air Forces on the Western Front approximately until September 1917. Then, with the arrival of more advanced machines, they began to be transferred to flight schools and rear units. On less important fronts, in Italy, Macedonia, Mesopotamia, and Palestine, they served much longer. Throughout the entire war, the British companies Sopwith, Westland, Hooper, Morgan, Vickers, and Ruston and Proctor built 1,282 of these machines. At the beginning of 1917, the leadership of the French Air Forces was seriously concerned about the state of bomber aviation. Most of the aircraft fleet at that time consisted of morally obsolete Voisins, Farmans, and Breguets, slow, unwieldy, and weakly armed machines with truss fuselages and pusher propellers. When encountering enemy fighters, they suffered heavy losses. Matters reached the point that in the autumn of 1916, the French had to abandon daytime raids on German rear targets and switch exclusively to night operations. French aviation companies received urgent orders to develop new bombers, but this could take several months, while aircraft were needed immediately. In these conditions, the 1.5 Strutter attracted the attention of the French. The French commander-in-chief, Marshal Nivelle, appealed to the Admiralty with a request to sell these machines and a license for their production. The British met their allies halfway and handed over 9 two-seat and 67 single-seat Sopwiths, although 40 of them were without engines, as well as all production documentation. The French moved quickly and on a large scale. The companies Amiot, Besson, Darac, Hanriot, Robert Esnault Pelterie, and Sarrazin immediately began producing Sopwiths. Just as in England, 3 modifications were built simultaneously, but they were named somewhat differently: a 2-seat reconnaissance aircraft, a 2-seat bomber, and a single-seat bomber. As we can see, while the British primarily needed fighters, the French faced problems with reconnaissance and bombers, which was reflected in the naming. The French 1.5 Strutters differed from the British only in that, instead of streamlined struts, they used paired steel cables wrapped with glued tape. During 1917, the French managed to stamp out about 4,500 Sopwiths, almost 4 times more than in England. For some time, this aircraft was the most numerous reconnaissance and light bomber in the French Air Forces on the Western Front. A total of 74 squadrons were fully equipped with these machines. But already by the end of that same year, France had begun serial production of the Breguet 14 and the Samson A2, which significantly surpassed the Sopwith in all parameters. The 1.5 Strutter, with its small useful load that had previously been overlooked, immediately lost its appeal. Voices began to be heard that it was more suitable for aerial tourism than for war. The Air Force Command, as if waking up, suddenly found itself faced with a huge number of brand new but already outdated machines that had to be dealt with somehow. The president of the United Aeronautics Committee, D'Aubigny, called this situation the Sopwith crisis. In the end, a significant number of the aircraft were distributed to flight schools, while 965 reconnaissance planes and 191 bombers were sent straight from the factories into reserve storage bases. In the spring of 1918, 514 of them were sold to the Americans as training aircraft. As of April 1, 1918, the French frontline squadron still had 395 reconnaissance and 47 bomber Sopwiths. Later, their numbers gradually declined, and by the beginning of October, they had disappeared completely. British and French Sopwiths were supplied during the war to the Belgians, 27 aircraft, Romanians, 17, Greeks, 10, and Japanese, 15. But the largest number of these machines went to Russia. In the summer of 1916, the Russian Directorate of the Military Air Fleet, after carefully studying the production capabilities of domestic factories, reached the disappointing conclusion that in the near future they would be able to cover only 44% of the front's needs for combat aircraft. The rest had to be purchased abroad. Traditionally, most of the machines had been bought in France, but this time it was decided to deviate somewhat from tradition and also pay attention to British equipment, especially since the British had offered several new models highly praised by the Russian Procurement Commission. These included the Vickers fighter, a multi-purpose aircraft equipped with a radio station and proposed as an artillery fire spotter, as well as the hero of this story, the Sopwith. Soon, a contract was signed with Great Britain for the delivery to Russia of aircraft of the specified types, including 148 1.5 Strutters, and for the organization in Moscow of a special aviation school to train Russian pilots and mechanics to work with British equipment. According to the contract, in November 1916, a group of British aviators led by Major Valentine arrived in Moscow. The group initially included 7 people, later joined by another 4. Among them were pilots, observers, specialists in aircraft engines, armament, and radio equipment. In March 1917, the first aircraft finally arrived: 5 Vickers, 5 Sopwiths, and 5 BE-2 type machines. From these, 3 training units were formed: a fighter unit, a reconnaissance unit, and an artillery spotting unit. The school began operations. Russian pilots, who had already completed the initial flight training course, quickly mastered the British machines, but further deliveries stopped. On the one hand, the sea route from England was far from safe. German submarines were sinking ships. In the North Sea, the steamship Burevestnik, which was transporting a batch of British Sopwith aircraft to Murmansk, went to the bottom. To bypass the most dangerous areas, ships had to make a huge detour almost as far as Iceland. But the main reason for the delays was not this. After the February Revolution, real chaos began in Russia. Rallies, strikes one after another, and the poor throughput capacity of the railways prevented the timely removal from the northern ports of the aviation equipment that had already arrived in Russia. Enormous stockpiles of weapons accumulated in Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, but almost nothing reached the front. In June, having never received the English aircraft, the Russian pilots dispersed to their aviation detachments. The English instructors, seeing the futility of their work, soon also submitted reports requesting transfer to the front. From them, a consolidated detachment was formed, which in July-August took part in battles near Tarnopol. For heroic assaults on German positions and inflicting heavy losses on the enemy, Major Valentine was personally thanked by General Kornilov and awarded the Order of St. George of the 4th class. Other English pilots also received various awards. In the autumn of 1917, the general collapse spread to the active army. Mass desertions, open refusal to obey orders, and even soldiers attacking their own officers became common occurrences. Seeing this, the Englishmen hastily left Russia. Only their commander remained there forever. In September, Major Valentine suddenly died of a heart attack at the age of 34. By the end of the summer navigation season, between 120 and 140 English Sopwith aircraft had arrived in Russia. In addition, more than 30 French-made machines were delivered. Though the exact number is unknown, records only note that a steamer carrying 5 Sopwiths departed from France on August 12, 1917, but this was far from the only shipment. In the same year, the Moscow plant Dux began independent construction of these aircraft. In total, according to Vadim Borisovich Shavrov, up to 100 machines were assembled, although most of them after the October Revolution. Only a few examples made it to the Russian-German front. Most awaited their fate in the warehouses of the Arkhangelsk port and in the central Moscow aviation park at Kodinka Field. where by November 1917 there were 72 Sopwiths. In March of the following year, the new Soviet government energetically set about evacuating military property from Arkhangelsk. They were pushed to do so by the intervention of Russia's former allies and the real threat of an English landing. A commission for the unloading of the Arkhangelsk port was created under the leadership of Commissar Alexander Vasilyevich Mojayev, formerly a worker at one of Petrograd's aircraft plants. Mojayev managed to organize the daily dispatch of trains carrying aircraft, engines, and other property to central regions of Russia. As a result, when on August 1st the English did indeed capture Arkhangelsk, only 18 unserviceable Sopwiths and 2 Nieuports fell into their hands. The evacuated machines were distributed among detachments. The need for them arose very soon. Civil war was breaking out in Russia. The Red Air Fleet first took part in battles near Kazan in August-September 1918. Sopwiths of the 23rd Corps and 4th Socialist Aviation Detachments, together with other machines, carried out reconnaissance of White Guard positions and bombed city quarters. The absence of white fighter aviation and anti-aircraft artillery made this possible without significant risk. By the autumn of 1918, Sopwiths, alongside Farman 30s and Nieuports of various modifications, were the most widespread aircraft in Soviet aviation. They were in service with many aviation detachments and were used on all fronts of the Civil War, from the polar Urals to the foothills of the Caucasus. At that time in Russia, there were no standardized rules for the designation of aircraft, especially foreign ones, which created great confusion in names. In documents of those years, besides Sopwith, one can find Sopwith, 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 and even Sopwith. Occasionally, Sopwith reconnaissance aircraft appears, but, as you may have guessed, all refer to the same machine. The original English name 1.5 Strutter was not encountered at all. Likely, this expression seemed too long and inconvenient. Near Arkhangelsk in 1918 to 1919, Sopwiths of the Kostroma Aviation Group were active. It should be noted that they faced exactly the same aircraft captured by the English and, after repair, handed over to the so-called Slavo-British Aviation Corps. This unit was formed from Russian pilots accepted into English service to fight Bolshevism. The Slavo-British carried out aerial reconnaissance and artillery spotting and bombed vessels of the Red Dvina flotilla. On November 1st, during one such raid, the Sopwith of Captain Kosovsky and Cornet Abramovich was shot down by anti-aircraft fire, making them the first casualties of white aviation in the Civil War in northern Russia. A Soviet Sopwith with a crew consisting of pilot Fyodor Grab and observer Adolf Schultz won the first documented aerial victory of the Civil War. On October 16, 1918, Schultz, from the turret machine gun, shot down a white Nieuport over the Shamara railway siding in the Urals. The Red Air Force also suffered losses, not so much in air combat as from numerous accidents and crashes caused by rapid physical wear of the machines and the use of poor quality fuel. After the separation of Azerbaijan and the loss of the Baku oil fields, the fuel tanks of aircraft had to be filled with alcohol or various substitutes such as the Kazan mixture, composed of gasoline, kerosene, and ether. Such fuel often caused engines to stall in flight, especially in winter. Nevertheless, Red Sopwiths continued to be actively used in 1919. On the Kolchak front in early June, they provided air cover for the crossing of the Belaya River near Ufa, and attacked white artillery concentrated on the eastern bank. One aircraft of this type, with pilot Kovalenko, was transferred to the staff of the famous Chapayev Division. On September 5th, during an attack by white Cossacks on Lobishchensk, Kovalenko was killed and the aircraft captured. Afterward, it flew bearing White Guard tricolor roundels on its wings. But this was not the only Sopwith in the ranks of Kolchak's army. From July to September 1919, a French reconnaissance aviation detachment operated on the Eastern Front. It consisted of 3 aircraft with their crews and ground services, including a well-equipped repair base. In September, the French left Russia, transferring all their equipment to the White Forces. Kolchak's pilots successfully used the Sopwiths in battles on the Tobol River, where they managed to shoot down a tethered balloon. Several air battles also took place there with Soviet fighters, which, however, ended without results. In November, during the hasty retreat of Kolchak's army, the Sopwiths, along with other aircraft, were captured by the Reds in Novonikolaevsk. now Novosibirsk. In the spring of 1921, the Soviet command transferred these and some other aircraft to the government of the so-called Far Eastern Republic, a temporary state formation that later became part of the Russian Federative Soviet Republic. On the southern front, the Red Army Sopwiths were part of the Special Purpose Aviation Group. It was formed in August 1919 from instructors of the Moscow Flight School to fight against the cavalry of General Mamontov, which had broken through the front. Soviet pilots scattered white cavalrymen with fragmentation bombs and machine gun fire. But during these actions, the group's commander, Bertolyubov, was shot down and captured. Several aviation detachments armed with Sopwiths fought in the summer and autumn of 1919 on the northwestern front against the White Army of General Yudenich, as well as Latvian and Estonian national formations. 2 aircraft that made forced landings on enemy territory were later incorporated into the Latvian Air Force. After crossing out the stars and painting their own emblems, red swastikas, the Latvians continued to operate these trophies for many years. Combat and non-combat losses steadily reduced the number of 1.5 Strutters in frontline units. By the summer of 1919, pre-revolutionary stockpiles were completely exhausted, and the supply of new aircraft from factories lagged far behind the needs of the front. The remaining machines were aging and increasingly required repairs. All this led to the fact that by the summer battles of 1920 on the Polish front, only a small number of Sopwiths took part, and by the following spring, the last of them were transferred to flight schools or scrapped.